Awesome. That's awesome. Okay, so I'd love to introduce Tania. Just bear with me while I pull out her bio. All right. So Tania is the founder and CEO of Baitner Design, a founding creator of Liberatory Design, a founding member of the Equity Design Collaborative, former faculty at the National Equity Project, and a former lecturer at the Stanford University D School. She's built a way of practicing design that helps organizations translate equity values into equitable products, programs, and cultures. She's an expert content creator and facilitator with over a decade of experience working globally. Tania is a graduate of Stanford University's Product Design Program, an advisor in Stanford's Design Impact Program, and a Strategic Block Fellow. I'd love to also acknowledge that the donations from today will be given to the Ukraine Emergency Appeal to help people over in the Ukraine. We've raised $320, so I'm very excited that we get to share that with the people over there and help them. So I'm going to pass over to Tania now, who will take us through a presentation.
Hi, y'all. So good to see you. I'm very excited about this cozy group. We're going to have a lot of time to talk. Looking forward to it. I am going to get started in a second, but just want to get you a sense of timing. My talk will be about 20 minutes, and I'm going to share some stories and some examples, and then we'll use the rest of the time just to talk. So definitely, if you have questions, if you want to share something that's resonating, I'd love to hear that. Okay, I'm going to get started. Let's get the right screen. Yes. Okay. Ahlan wa sahlan, as we say in Arabic, marhaba, welcome. I'm very glad that you're here. I'm going to talk about my journey with design. And when I say design, I'm mostly talking about design thinking, but whether you work as a social worker, you work in operations, you're an architect, all of our fields, I think, have a lot of overlapping space. So I am excited to hear what resonates with you regardless of where you work. We love to start at Baitner with a grounding quote. This is by Invincible, who's a Detroit-based artist and activist. And they share, every time we create, we are shifting the paradigm that the world is inevitable and determined to be unjust. We are keeping the human spirit of resistance and resilience alive. And I love this quote because when I first came to creative work and design thinking, I wanted to understand, I had a passion for doing liberation or social justice work, and I wanted to understand what could be the intersection. And what really thrilled me is the more as I started to study liberation practices and some of the greatest movement leaders from across the world, so much of what they write about is creativity. And so it felt like, oh, there's so much that could serve each other here in these movements. What does it look like to do that? That's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. Thank you, Jax, for giving that long, lovely introduction about my background. So I won't say too much more, but I come from the Stanford design world, and then I started Baitna. In Arabic, it means our home. And we work with a range of folks. People ask, what kind of work are you doing? It really ranges from nonprofit, foundation, for-profit. What we're trying to do is we're trying to help people, oops, went too fast, to bridge the gap between, we have these intentions for practicing equitably, but how do we actually do it? So that's the common theme. We help people build products, programs, policies, cultures, whatever it is. We're there to help them with the process, to help them walk their own walk across the bridge instead of sharing our recommendations or answers. So Jax also did a beautiful land acknowledgement and welcoming. I want to do one too, since I'm dialing in from San Francisco, which is the traditional homelands of the Muwekma, Ohlone, and Ramaytush nations. And this was a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for many native tribes. We acknowledge it, especially in the United States, because it's an ongoing colonial project of which we participate. And we use this time to explicitly express gratitude to the stewards of the land and water who came before us. And part of this tradition, we're taking a cue from Native elders and how they use the time to all acknowledge, bless, and give gratitude to the land. So we want to thank them. And something we're on our own learning journey at Baitna, we do something called a Shumi land tax, which we essentially pay what could have been a rent to a local rematriation group led by the Ohlone Nation, given that their land was unceded. So thank you for continuing to join us as we learn more about how we can be good neighbors and guests and hosts in this land. Okay, so I was mentioning a bit more about Baitna and what we do. Oh, it's a disco in here, y'all. I keep pressing the wrong button. Here we go. So I mentioned a bit about what we do, and our vision, what really Baitna started with, was how could we make a world of thriving communities where people can craft their own liberation, essentially. So our job as designers is to be facilitators. We truly believe, one of my mentors always says people can solve their own problem under the right conditions. So what's our role to help facilitate those conditions is sort of our vision for how the world we can support, even in a small way, liberation movements. Okay, so I'm going to talk about design. That's what a lot of us are here for. And I would argue that design is a political act. And what I mean by that is not tied to a political party or a particular issue, but rather there is no neutral design. Everything that we make has an impact, right? Like when I was first starting in design, they would talk about design or design thinking, and then separately design for social impact. But I would say that all design has social impact, and whether it's negative, positive, neutral, depends on our process and what we are indexing for as good design. I truly feel like this comes from my own mistakes, my own practice, which I'll talk about today. But unless we're mindful about how we're making decisions and essentially designing, we can reproduce inequity in our decision making, right? Because what is it? Isn't there a saying? I don't know if it's attributed to Einstein, but it's like if you keep doing the same thing and expect to get a different outcome, then you're really off target. I'm not saying that exactly how it's supposed to be said, but you get my point, right? Like if we keep working in status quo ways, we're always going to get status quo outcomes. So my obsession over the last decade essentially has been, how do we shift how we work to serve our goals? And not surprisingly, our values and principles become extremely important. How are they baked into our design process and our decision making? So if we want to get the equitable outcomes, we have to design equitably. So then the question became, oh boy, how do we do that? Well, how would we shift how we already work? Speaking for myself. So to tell you my design politics or my values, I describe myself as an equity designer, designing for liberation. So I describe equity as an acknowledgement that systems are broken right now and they are not serving people in equal ways at all, right? So based on where you're born, how you're perceived physically, your gender, right? There are all these different things that significantly have an impact on your life, nothing to do with who you are as a whole human being. So we would say these systems are very broken, right? Or even think about wealth distribution and the fact that we have billionaires, and where I live in San Francisco, we have a lot of both, people who are homeless, don't have access to homes. So what does it mean? The system's broken. You get my point. I could go on for days. But to be an equity designer means I'm acknowledging this is broken. We need to get help and action and change right now in this broken system, while simultaneously designing for liberation, which I would describe as, all right, these systems are broken altogether. Like, how do we dream up a completely different world? Not just get people what they need right now, but also create something that will be liberating for all of us. So it's sort of this bridge of both. That's how I describe my politics. So in my design education, I think early on, I'm going to tell you a story of my journey of how I came to this. I had a lot of questions about how design was practiced. I would hear things like, when we go and work with communities, we want you to go extract the most interesting nuggets from interviews, or even to this day, some of the world's top design firms describe it as story mining when we go in to learn from community. And it felt like, whoa, why are we using this explicitly extractive language to talk about a community we're supposedly trying to partner with or to help? Or we might hear things like, the way I was taught was, people don't know what they want, you have to tell them what they want. There's that famous saying they attribute to Ford, I believe, which is if Ford asked people what they want, they'd say faster horses. That's sort of like a Silicon Valley saying to describe, like, we got this, like, we'll interview them and then we'll tell them what they really need. This came up a lot in my education and in the field, honestly. When I started to push back or I had doubts, I would also often heard things like, well, if harmful things are happening, like, they're just bad designers, like, that's a one-off case. But to me, it started to feel like, no, it keeps happening in my own practice and with my peers. Like, there has to be something about the process that's breaking down for us that doesn't work anymore. So I'll tell you the story of where it really broke for me, which was in Cape Town. Part of my work was to travel globally and to try to make design as accessible as possible. So it was a great intention, right? Without the fancy space and the Post-its and all the things, like, how could we make it fit into people's everyday lives? So our curriculum was around learning from cities. How can people just in their own city with little to no materials be practicing design and deepening their skill set? So we showed up in design as stewards to offer this free workshop. Anyone in the community could come. And essentially people in Cape Town were saying the truths that we weren't hearing elsewhere. which I will forever be grateful for. It's a bummer that we had to go to Cape Town for this to happen, but the learning and the legacy of what they taught me in particular, I'll forever be grateful, which is, not surprisingly, we showed up and we got a lot of responses. Amongst them were we heard a few things. One was like, who invited you? We already got some design stuff over here, so not sure why you're here. The second was, you're flying over from a fancy university, but you weren't invited. This feels like a little bit colonial. And then we also got some feedback directly about the workshops. Like, we had people going out to learn in the city, but people didn't fully understand what the process was or what it meant. So they were interviewing people. One person they interviewed was working, and they kept trying to interrupt him, so the participants in the workshop. And he ultimately said, stop interrupting me, like my boss is going to fire me if he sees me not working. And they started taking photos. And then the person said, stop, you're making me feel like I'm enslaved. It still hurts years later. But if you think about some of the status quo, how design is practiced, they were doing traditional design. They were extracting nuggets. They were learning what they need to learn in the shortest amount of time from this community member, but there was no real partnership or understanding of the power dynamics, or does this actually even serve this person? Do they want to talk to us? So this got to the point where all the cracks in design thinking, I had these doubts, but I kept looking to elders in the design community and felt like, well, I must know better. Am I missing something? And my colleagues and peers in Cape Town, finally, I was like, no, this is definitely broken. And so I pivoted the trip and took people out to lunch and to coffee and talked to anyone who was willing to basically be like, you're ahead of us. You're already rethinking design. What have you learned? And essentially they had become the world design capital in 2014. So all this money fled into Cape Town to do design work. And what they had done was led a lot of workshops in townships. So a lot of predominantly white folks moved into townships to do these 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour workshops about design. And so the community by the time we showed up was like, oh yeah, we've heard of designers. They come in here, they ask us for our painful sob stories, and then they vanish and don't do shit. So essentially they were sort of like, no, thanks. We don't trust you. So it was a hard reality, but it's also the validation that I needed to acknowledge that, like, yes, this is real. The cracks are real. And I don't want to practice this way anymore. Like, this is directly in tension with my values, but design still has a lot of potential. So what is a way to reconcile the two is where I landed. Why is this impact, our intention, the impact of what we're doing is not aligned to my justice intentions? How do I bridge that gap? So I'll share, I touched on these a little bit, but I'll share just 3 critiques of things as I started to really tear design apart. I spent years doing this with others, understand why is it hurting? Why is it not working? And one of them that I started to mention was a power imbalance, right? The way they taught us and the way programs are operated, there would be the designer who knows what they're doing, has some sort of degree, is like working with a nonprofit, and then the people we interview, right? Who were interpreting what they say, what they mean, and ultimately making the decisions. So this created sort of a perpetuated practice of designing for people. Like, we know we'll consult you, but we got this. Like, we're here to help you. We're here to solve your problems, instead of understanding what partnership could look like. Another thing I struggled with that I mentioned, it started to feel very extractive. We build relationships, we ask people for painful things, and then ultimately we make a lot of decisions without them, right? And they may or may not ever see the solution implemented. So what does it mean for us to shift the dynamic from take into making them informed, power enacted partners in deciding if they want to contribute and how? I also noticed when I would go to design conferences, the people interviewed are essential to the project and the success of the project, but they were never mentioned in presentations. They were never given credit. It was very much like the glory of the designer, and the people who are critical partners were sort of left to the wayside as like obvious contributors, but not in need or recognition. The last I'll share something I struggle with is that I felt design was ahistorical or apolitical. And what I mean by that, it was sort of separated from reality, right? So it's like, let's not talk about oppression, race, the history of indigenous peoples. There's like all this stuff that is greatly impacting our reality, but it was leaving that out. So both, it wasn't talking about the historical and real struggles today, but also not the resistance and the creativity of those communities that we could use in the design world to make more impactful solutions. So this came up a lot, for example, if we're working on a project about healthy food systems in the US, but we wouldn't be talking about why certain communities were redlined and districted. so that Black families could not buy or rent property in white neighborhoods, why they don't have access to fresh food in food deserts, right? There's like all this stuff. If you think about how could we design a better food system, if we're just leaving out all of this, it's sort of designing in the dark, in my opinion. It's like, how impactful can your interventions really be if you're missing all this other stuff? So these for me became my biggest pain points, both in my practice, but with others in the with my other peers in the field. And we got to this point of like, listen, there has to be a better way to design. Design's whole point is that like you can change anything. So what if we just redesign design itself? Like what would be our new version? So that started this journey of, first it was like take it down to the studs, and then it was like rebuild the house. What would we want to do instead? So with several colleagues, you'll see next to me, Victor, David, Tom, and Susie, we came together in 2016 to say, what could be this intersection with the equity and design worlds? How could we strengthen each other's practices and acknowledge some of the weaknesses? So we came up with this framework. This is our 2021 version. We've adapted it since, and the BETNA team created this different graphic. The essence of the graphic is trying to take cues from emergent metaphors. So this is a flower in soil. And for those that are familiar with design thinking, you'll see some obvious differences. I'll just speak to a few. One is that notice and reflect are at the core of our practice. And this is the things I mentioned, like noticing power, noticing the history of how things came to be, building a practice of reflection in terms of, are we building relational trust? Are we attending and making space for healing if harm is occurring? So there's all this intentionality that grounds everything we do. And then in addition to the flower petals, which are all the different ways we can move in the design world, they're also sitting in this soil called See the System, which is trying to understand we're not designing in isolation. There's all these other things, both oppressive and liberatory, impacting it. How do we inform all of our moves with these? So those three components ground all the other work. And when we created the design, Liberatory Design, we created this framework and a card deck. The PDF is online for free if you want to check it out later. It has a lot more detail than I'm covering. And then after that, we went back to our own organizations. And so at BETNA Design, working with our partners over the years, we continually iterated it and built our own custom tools to understand what would be most helpful to people in the field to actually enact this kind of change. So what I'm going to share is from our BETNA perspective of how we've evolved liberatory design. So the intention with it is it helps us move out of that autopilot status quo way of working into closer to our alignment. I describe it as like the bowling, the lanes, what are those called? The bumpers in the bowling alley, right? Like we're not going to perfectly be liberatory every moment. We're not going to be totally equitable every second, but how do we just remind ourselves with these bumper lanes to stay aligned to our values? So I'm not going to read all of this. Feel free to take a peek, but this is how at BETNA Design, we have shifted liberatory design. I went into particular aspects that I mentioned that I found hard or that I wanted to add and shifted those. So you'll see things here about power and identity, about oppression and history, recognizing the people we're interviewing as experts and consultants, right? When they work with us on projects, we actually pay them because they're consultants, just like anyone else would be. Their lived experience is critical to the work. We look into healing, and then a lot of our work is also centered around co-design, which means instead of just interviewing people, how can we involve them in making decisions? Because they have a lot to say. This is their life often, and their community's livelihood at stake. So I could say a lot more about this, but it just gives you a little flavor of like what's changed beyond the graphics. And I definitely invite you to check out the deck. If you're curious, the PDF is available online. I'd say another big shift in addition to how we practice are also the mindsets. So we asked ourselves as a team, what these mindsets I created with the original crew as well when we made the card deck is what mindsets or practices are critical to how we, right? Because there's tools like how do you do an interview differently, but there's also how do we behave and believe. So I'll just highlight a few of these. You'll see we have one called Attend to Healing. Like these projects can be heavy, y'all. I'm sure in the work that you do, you encounter stuff that like really weighs on the heart. What does it mean to open space for healing if we want to process together or privately or whatever that looks like? How do we even acknowledge if some harm has occurred? And then there's so many other pieces here, but these mindsets in particular, I invite you to play with. We use them a lot with teams to say, how do you want to change your program? Or let's say you want to work through some relational issue at work. What mindset do you want to commit to with each other as you have this even one conversation? So check them out if you're curious. And as I wrap up, I just want to share one case study to give you a little bit of an example of what it can look like. And this was in Columbus, Ohio. I know we have someone in Columbus from the audience, in the audience today. So I'll share about that. This was a co-design project, meaning we were working with people who have lived experience, and we're looking at something called the benefits cliff. So in the US, to have access to social benefits, there's certain thresholds, right? You have to be making less than this much, you have to live in this kind of place, blah, blah, blah. So they have requirements to be able to be eligible for benefits. But there's something called the cliff, which is people who are eligible, they fit the requirements. Maybe they get the opportunity to get a promotion or a raise at work. And let's say they're going to get $1 or $2 more per hour even. That might shift their eligibility. So let's say they're making an additional $200 a month, but now they're no longer in the bracket of people who qualify. So they might lose $800 and $900 in benefits. So suddenly they have no prescriptions paid and they don't have childcare, right? So they're stuck in this cliff, which is like, wait, I want to take the promotion, but I'm going to lose all this support. So they get sort of stuck in these really difficult choices. So the project was, how can we support families? What do they care about when they're in this cliff? And what could we possibly do about supporting them in the transitions? So let me share first a little bit of history. I'm going to go back, hold on, to tee this up. So we started the project. In an ideal world, we would have done this history beforehand, but I'm gonna be real with you. We got into interviews and then we were like, oh dear, there's something in here we are not understanding. So we were talking to a lot of women who have multiple children and are supporting their families on benefits. And the kind of things we would hear, they would say, I'm so ashamed I'm on benefits, or they would say, it's a generational curse, I've failed. They said, this is like 75% my fault. I can't believe it. So there's all this narrative around blaming and shaming themselves, the fact that they were on benefits. And we took a step back as a team and we're like, why does this keep coming up? We're not, this is a basic right. People, residents in this country qualify for this. We pay taxes for this. This is something we have agreed on. We have voted on that this is a right. And so why is there all of this shame and blame underneath it? So we can write a whole dissertation about that. I'm sure someone has, but just to share some context, we essentially went to the interviews and said, like, let's take a step back. What is the story of this in the US? Like, what is the narrative and the false narrative that's come up? So I'm going to share some pretty dark stuff, just some heads up to brace yourself. But in North Carolina, a state on the East Coast, between 1929 and 74, they were sterilizing residents, over 7,500 for being quote unquote feeble-minded and unfit to reproduce. And many of these were women who were on welfare. So government is explicitly saying that you are not fit to reproduce because you're on welfare. So think about what that says about the narrative of people who are living on benefits. Another is that it became highly politicized in the Reagan era. So Reagan and his government were trying to create justification for cutting benefits and reducing access to benefits. And so he would use sensationalized stories that actually today we would call fake news because they were not based in fact, of welfare fraud to create this argument that like, oh, people are abusing the system. And created this very, very racist myth called the welfare queen, which is this idea that there are these usually Black women, who's very racially targeted, who are just making all this money off welfare, just living the good life, which not true, right? To live on benefits, it's like you're barely affording water and internet and medicine. So anyway, the point is there were all these narratives in the US, some political, some narrative-based, some literally physical things that were creating this shame and blame and focus on individuals and saying, if you're on benefits, you are unfit, something's wrong with you, you're mooching on the country, essentially. I won't go too deep into the larger story, but you get the point, right? Like there's so much, speaking to the system, there is so much that is seeping into our project. So as designers, if we're operating without any of this context, doesn't mean we're gonna go spend 6 years researching this now, but it just means we need to have some tethering to re-enter that conversation with our co-designers and start to say like, when you say that, what does that mean to you? You know, has someone ever said anything to you? And so as we started to dig in, we would hear things like, yeah, when I go to check in at the welfare office, the person at the front desk treats me like a piece of trash. We were like, whoa. A lot of our solutions ended up shifting because at first I made this prototype. I thought it was so cool, y'all. It was like it's like a scale to help people figure out their eligibility. Like, oh, if I get a raise, what do I lose? It was like a very technical solution to help them plan. Like, or if I move to this zip code, what happens? And they sort of gave me the reaction like, cool, fine. I already do that on my own. You know, it would really help. And then we started talking about all this stuff. Like why I delay going into the office because they treat me so disrespectfully in front of my children, and I don't want them to see that. So our whole project pivoted to being about dignity and the emotional experience of being on benefits, less so than the technical solution of this number and that number and that number. We also talked to some folks who are policymakers. That's probably a story for another time, to try to do more, see the system of like, okay, most impactful thing would probably be to change the policy. Do we have any influence there as designers? And if not, what can we do, right? Both liberation and equity. What can we do now? And what's the long-term game? Because these policies are not working for our families. Okay. I want to be conscious of time. I said 20 minutes, but I got so excited about all the stories that I shared a lot. I'm almost done it.
You're like, sorry to interrupt. You take your time. You've got plenty of time.
Great. Okay. Clearly, I love this topic. So I'm going to wrap up, though. I'm going to share a couple more resources. One is I just want to name, in the early days when I was in that low point of questioning of like, my practice design, why? I found these people. They're from across the US. So we saw someone wrote an article, someone wrote a Medium piece. We all started to call each other, and we formed what became the Equity Design Collaborative. And we would meet every month just to share practices and talk about struggles and wins. So I'd always love to shout out these folks. We have a website if you're curious to learn about other people's organizations within the group. Everybody's up to something really cool in sort of a different arena or a different theory of change. So it's definitely out there. We're not the only ones. And I also want to name that we used to be kind of niche out there. We were like trying to find as many people as we could who talked about this. And now it's just a tidal wave. Both, I think it's a combination of more people entering the field and people that were always there. We just couldn't find each other. So if you're curious about this, there's a lot of different things it's called, right? So check it out. There's restorative, equity design, design justice. There's amazing communities around all of these. And a lot of them are global, all over the world or concentrated in certain areas. So just want to shout out, if this is your jam and you are curious, definitely check out us in Liberatory Design, but also welcome to the family because it's big and we're growing. These are also some books I found just really mind-blowing in the last couple of years. So if you want to learn some more, definitely take a screenshot and check them out. These authors are on the cutting edge and doing really cool stuff. So I highly suggest. Okay, I have some questions for you. I want to hear your thoughts, but I'll drop these in the chat later. I would love to hear how you define your politics. If you've ever been in situations, whether it was a design project or some other community project where you felt like, oh, it doesn't feel good, and how you think about what our role is in sort of pushing back if a project's not going well, or if a client or a boss or someone is asking for us for something we don't agree with. So I'm gonna hold these. I want to hear what questions you have, but I'll drop them in the chat later. And yeah, we can just learn from each other. I'm excited to hear from y'all. So I'll close and just say shukran. Thank you for having me, and can't wait to hear what you're passionate about.
Thank you so much, Tania. I'm just wondering, I noticed Marge has got her hand up. Marge, would you like to ask a question now?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. Or if you have something that you wanted to say before we launch into questions, Jax, I can also hold on to it.
Well, we have let's just take a pause for a minute. We have 25 minutes to spend here. So one idea is we could start with questions, and maybe we could have a look at the questions that Tania's posed and take a bit of time to feel into those questions together. How does that sound? Awesome. So yeah, maybe we'll start with Marja. If anyone else has a question, please raise your hand. Go for it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Tania, for that really illuminating talk. I appreciate it so much, what you shared, walking us through the process and the thought process in your own journey. So I hope I don't kind of derail the plan that Jax just made with this question, which I think may be a little bit meaty. But the thing that, as I kind of try to immerse myself into this way of doing design, which to me feels intuitively right. The things I think, one of the many things that I think that define it are the slowness, right? The need for patience and depth, responsibility and responsiveness, compassion, etc. And as I think about that and just kind of in interest of full disclosure, I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, so that's kind of where I go, right, is to kind of slow down and be with people and try to understand their needs. But I feel like there's this inherent tension between the resources that this way of conducting design requires, both resources in terms of time and resources in terms of money, and the tension between that and the resources that are available to conduct projects like this. So I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to how you've navigated that tension. I guess first of all, if you've seen that tension, and B, if you can just discuss a little bit about how you've navigated it, that would be great. Thank you.
Totally, I appreciate that question. I've definitely felt this a lot. So I'm sure others in the audience might have too. I think, well, we do run a business at BETNA, and this became a big question for us in terms of, in the early days, it was like, what is this? Let's experiment. And then it became like, oh, would this be helpful to other people? And so that became that journey of trying to find the right partners. And I would say now, knock on wood, we've gotten to the point where people that come to us know that, and they want that. And so we're no longer having to make the case and convince, and they're coming in saying like, no, we want to do right by our people. We want to change the way we behave because we've tried this other thing, we tried it XYZ ways, design thinking, this flavor, agile, and like, it's still not working. So by the time they get to us, luckily we have that permission because they're saying like, we're hungry to learn how to do it differently. But I'm fully aware that that's often not the case with design projects. And in terms of conversations we had early on, I think it became a lot about trade-offs. I think K.A. McKercher, who wrote Beyond Sticky Notes, they have a great quote in there that says, if you don't have time to build relationships, you don't have time to do co-design. When I read that, it was like, oh, yes, which is so true. But I think when we do early conversations with clients, those are sort of the things we're asking. We're trying to suss out where they are on the spectrum. And it comes out pretty quickly, right? Of like, it needs to be done by this date. This is the way we're going to do it. We don't have time for that. Let's just use people we already have. That signals to me that the urgency is high. And we try pushing back, like, okay, where's the deadline coming from? Like, who's accountable on the other end? And sometimes we can help them unravel it. And they feel like, oh, okay, it's a made up deadline. Now that you said it, like, we're the only ones who care about this deadline. We could change it. And sometimes it's like, woo, breakthrough. And sometimes it's just a no. Like, there's been some tech clients where they're like, we need it in 6 weeks and it has to happen. It has to be live. And we've just said at that point, like, what we say is that's not the kind of work we like to do, and it won't produce value for you. And we don't do any work that's not going to produce value. So from a business perspective, we're just like, no. You know, it's like if you go to a physical therapist and you're like, I just majorly sprained my leg, but I'm running a marathon in a week. Let's go. The physical therapist would be like, no, I'm not working with you. You're just going to go hurt yourself and then say I'm a bad physical therapist. So all this to say is a long answer. We have the privilege of getting to choose now. In the early days, I didn't as much. And I would say that caused a lot of dissonance for me. Because there's a lot of projects I would either put in extra hours unpaid. I would be texting the co-designers late at night to try to make up for things that were happening because of the speed. So it was very hard. I wish I had a clearer answer, but if you can have the opportunity to be selective in who you work with, that changes the game. And some of those people have FOMO. Sometimes they call us back like, oh, how'd you get those results? And we're like, well, it took longer. That's a long answer. I'll be briefer next time. I'm sure there's more folks want to add too. I'd be curious to hear from you too. If there's anything that we're talking about that you have experience with, there's so much knowledge in this room. I would invite people to jump into.
I just want to say thank you for the long answer.
Yeah, sure. It's a real struggle. So other folks have questions or even just a comment of something that either really vibed with you or you disagree with potentially?
I have a question around, you mentioned that you use the Liberatory Design deck and then you've crafted tools around that. Could you unpack a little bit what you mean, what sort of tools you've been creating and using?
Yes. So I would say when we work with our partners, let's say we're talking about how do we do empathy in a way that feels liberating? How do we build that trust? How do we think about consent? So within that, depending on how much time the partner has to work with us, we have remotely, it's mostly digital tools around like, okay, here's your 5-step guide. Like, here's how to talk about consent. Let's make some decisions about who we're reaching out to. Can we compensate them? So that's the bumper lanes to just say, instead of abstractly, like, here's a mindset, run with it. We'll say like, all right, this is what we've done that we've seen work, but within the tools, they have to make decisions. So it'll be like, this is a guide of what you're trying to do. How are you going to do it as a team? So within empathize, define, we just have a set of sort of step-by-step pieces that help them get there, that either are much more structured than traditional design thinking tools or just index towards different outcomes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Hi.
So I would like to build on what Jax asked you about the cards, because, I mean, well, thank you about the presentation. I'm a practitioner of co-creation and co-design for many, many years. Awesome. So it didn't feel novel, a lot of the concepts that you were explaining. I'm still curious about the word liberation, but we'll get there. That's my second question. My first one is, since you want to work with a highly diverse group of people, right? Mm-hmm. How are you dealing with the different mental models? Because, for example, card sorting, it's a very cognitive, but also you need to know a metaphor and analogies and things like that to work well with that. And my work in Africa, for example, it didn't work well with a lot of people thinking that way. It's more of a Western type of thinking. So how you bridge those different mental models as you ask the participation of the people that you're designing with, right? The paradigm of change, right? The paradigm shift that happens decades ago, right? From the for to the with in practice.
Yes. Right. Mm-hmm. Can you say more? I want to make sure I understand the question. When you say the mental models being different or the frameworks, could you give an example?
Yeah, the example is the metaphor and analogy, for example. Like there are people, since you're using card sorting and design methodologies, design it's very contextual and use a lot of metaphor and analogies, right? Analogical thinking to bring the people so they can create their own. So that's already a mindset. And not everybody thinks that way. That's what I'm trying to say. Like the different, like you're presenting a tool, like the tool serves for everybody. That's probably the simplest way that I can put it. So my curiosity is, does that tool serve for a variety of people? Or have you encountered that different people have different mental models, are not understanding or using the tools in the same way?
Okay, I understand. That's helpful. Thank you. I would say when we're working with co-designers, my top priority is to build trust. My second priority is to allow them as much as possible to walk in and to contribute them in the maximum that they can. So what that looks like, to your point of the metaphors and the tools and the card decks, we don't use most of that. When we work with co-designers, we don't talk about liberatory design this, empathize that. We are trying to make it as easy as possible. My role is mostly the facilitator to let them walk in. So we'll walk in and say like, hey, thanks for being here. This is why we invited you. This is who else is here and what they bring to the table after we've briefed them and built all the trust. And then we'll say like, all right, step one is we want to learn from you and others in community about what has been hardest about this challenge and how you're currently finding workarounds. They'll be like, okay, I know workarounds. Who should we call? Right? It's not like here's empathize and the tools are this and this and that. Like we've noticed the more that we brief them in process, the less they engage. Because I'm actually working on a co-design project right now in Columbus. And just yesterday we were on the call and one of our co-designers was like, I don't think I'm doing it right. Did I say it right? Because we were using a tool that the client wanted to see at the end. We're like, you know what? Drop the tool. This is not helping. Because he started to get into like, I don't know, I don't get it. So there's so much nuance to your question. We could talk about it all night, but I think our role has been give them what they're contributing to right away in layman's terms in a way that they see the value of, right? Because that's the other thing. If we're like, let's do this empathize, they start to be like, why? I'm extremely busy. Like, what does this do for my community? So I think our process has shifted a lot. And like, yes, we're still building agendas behind the scene and prepping tools and stuff, but to try to make it as easy as possible for them to walk in, give what they want to give, and then walk out.
So then the liberation, it's because of the outcome. Like, because the process is a co-design process. What you're describing to me, it's a co-design process.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. So then the liberation part is because that's your purpose. Like, that's the outcome that you want to achieve going through that co-design process.
Yes. So the vision is liberation. And our goal is both that the outcomes of the work together better serves the community and is more tied to equitable outcomes, but also that the process is more equitable. So when co-designers work with us, they're saying things at the end, like, this was worth my time. When's the next project? Like, I want to bring in other people. That to us is through working together, regardless of the project, we're also shifting power in the community. So both, yeah, the process and the outcomes, ideally.
Good, appreciate, thank you.
Yeah. Other reactions or questions?
What value are you noticing your processes are delivering for community?
Good question. I think it has increased accountability by quite a lot, in the sense that we're finding that partners, other designers on the team, whether it's a client, a government policy member, whatever it is, they are personally feeling a higher level of pressure and accountability to take action afterwards. We have seen much higher implementation rates with a co-design process than not with a co-design process, because literally their colleagues, the co-designers, are there every step of the way. And also in our experience, they're calling. They're like, it's been 2 weeks. Have you talked to the mayor? You said you were going to talk to the mayor, right? Like, they have their own communities organized around this. So I think one of the primary values is that, one, they have increased power to hold people accountable to the solutions, and that also they are, a lot of our co-designers return. So then they become part of a citywide cohort of people that are contributing to government project after government project after government project. So my hope, ideally, and a lot of the project outcomes have been implemented, especially in Columbus, but my hope is that it's starting to shift also on a micro level. We could talk about the other people on the project realizing that these people are experts and they can't do work without them. And then for communities, they have increased influence over project outcomes, visibility, like some of them are presenting to the mayor, visibility with government leaders, that sort of thing. So there's both the micro of the people and how they're changed, but also hopefully the way it impacts the larger scale.
I think there's a few hands up. Susan, would you like to go?
Sure, thanks. And yeah, thanks so much for this presentation. It's super interesting, and I love this topic. I tend to talk a lot about designing for equity and, and social impact and stuff, and this absolutely resonates. One of the questions I had, and perhaps I missed it, but you've spoken a lot about talking, about sort of the initial, input of your design partners in, the folks that you're collaborating with. Could you say a little bit, excuse me, about how you keep them engaged on projects? So later in the process, as you're getting more and more feedback about what you're designing?
Yes, great question. So in the more intensive co-design projects, I talk about co-design as a spectrum, and teams can engage in co-design moments, or the whole process can be embedded in co-design. So co-design moment would be like, okay, traditional models, we just consult people, interview them, and then maybe we test some prototypes at the end. So co-design moment could be like, you know what, they should really be here when we generate ideas. Let's also bring them in, right? So it's like becoming more co-design-y, but maybe a team for whatever reason can't do it all the way. And I would argue co-design is not always the right answer. Sometimes there's not trust built, right? With governor partners, people are like, no way we're co-design. So like sometimes it's not the right move, but it can be. Or let's say a team is totally new. When I work with partners who have not done design before, we often don't advise they do co-design because then they're learning on community members and it really can hurt the trust. Okay, that wasn't your question though. I'm on a tangent. You were saying, yes, okay. So with the most intensive co-design projects, meaning they're there the whole time, they're also involved in building prototypes. And I would say what I found most different from not having them in those phases is they will, how to say that this is recorded, I can curse, right? A little bit. Is like they'll call bullshit a lot earlier. Like we're brainstorming and they're like, cool, Tania, that you think that's cool, but like we already solved it this way. Like we're good on that one. Or this is not as interesting as you think. This would be more interesting. That happened a couple of times. We did a project with youth experiencing homelessness and we were talking about maybe there's this mobile truck and it drives through and you can do like an ad hoc job. So whatever camp you're at, you can get paid for that day. They're like, cool. But they would say things like, well, I have a job that I'm looking for, but I come in with my stuff. They know that I'm housing insecure. They won't give me the job. So like, I can't even get through the interview. So then they were like, I need a place for my stuff. How about that? So I think that's the biggest shift is before we get too far into prototypes and how this could work, they're steering us. And then in terms of implementation, I want to shout out Heather Savaris that we work with. She works at the Columbus Foundation, has been setting up all these highly complex co-design projects. She's the one that's talking to the government, that's calling the stakeholders, that's texting with the co-designers. So she is the one in terms of long-term relationship building that keeps people connected. So it's both her proactively reaching out and also the co-designers asking, like, excuse me, it's been 3 months. What happened with that?
Well, that's cool that you have that relationship that they want to find out what's happening.
Yeah. Heather's awesome. I wish she was here. She could talk so much more about all that she's done to design that.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, Josh.
Hey, Tania. Good to see you again.
I recognize that face. Great to see you.
Great to see you. I so enjoyed that. Every time I hear you speak, it's always like a fresh take. And yeah, you know, I know it's like a vein running through the story, but it's always different. And it was great to hear. My question, Tania, is we've been reflecting a lot on not necessarily only liberatory design, but the act of designing for liberation in partnership across contexts and across cultures. And I guess my question is, what do you think, or what's your take on what some of the key levers for designers are to move away from a reliance on tools to instead maintain the heart and intention of designing for liberation while co-designing across different contexts?
Whoa, what a question. I will try to answer it. And I don't know if it will cover all of that, but I think for me as a designer, early in my practice, when I started teaching, someone coached me and they said, like, very cool that you know all this stuff about design, that you can explain all this to these people, but Tania, what they care about is how do I do the thing? So they actually coached me. They did like drills, like, how can you explain this in as few words as possible? The practice was just like try to get me to get succinct, but I feel like that has showed up a lot in co-design, to your point of like not over relying on tools or this and that. It became very much like, what do people need to know to walk into these empathy interviews? Bang. What do they need to know to be able to build a prototype that's going to be helpful? So I think a lot of it became letting go of like, yes, I can make the most beautiful Miro with all these cool voting features, but like people are calling on a landline. They don't care about my Miro. So a lot of it was like letting go of my ego, but still holding on to what's the minimum structure we need to move forward, right? Because we've also been in those brainstorms where it's like super frustrating. There's no structure. It's been 50 minutes. We've had 3 ideas. So it's trying to find the balance of like, what's the minimum I can do to that point of like create the right, people can solve their problems in the right conditions. It's like our job is to perfect what are the conditions to get this moving, but not to get people intimidated or to opt out. And it ranges on the audience. Like by the time we get to the second or third co-design project, our co-designers might feel very comfortable and they want to do more. They want to talk about like, hey, this interview practice isn't working. What's the next level? So sometimes they want to, but we try to follow their lead.
Thanks, Tania. I think Viv has her hand up.
Hi, Tania. Thanks for a lovely presentation. I love that quote, moving at the speed of trust, and trust being so important, relationships being really key before you do anything, particularly with communities that are vulnerable or at the margins. And, I wanted to ask a question about how you might go about building that trust with some of those, remote or, communities that you're really not familiar with. Do you do anything differently? You might be able to give us insights around.
Great question. Yes, I'll share my thoughts, and I feel like I'm still learning a lot from others in the field who are really good at this. And I'm sure folks in this room have thoughts. I know when I was reading Beyond Sticky Notes, that was one of the primary things I was taking away. It was like, yes, I highlighted almost every page. I think what I sit with is I feel like there tends to be a binary of like, oh, no, I'm not of that community. I shouldn't bother them. I can't engage, like, and then the other binary is like, I got this. They're going to love it when I come here. Right. And so we've definitely seen a lot in the original, like the first wave of design thinking was like, we're going to help them. They're going to love it. Like even me going to Cape Town. Right. And then people are kind of like, no, thanks. Or like, really, you're not helping. I think the other end of the spectrum is over indexing to say I have no role. Right. So early, I did that. I went the other direction and I was like, okay, I can only work in communities where there are women my age or where we're working with Lebanese Americans. And I started to index on like, this is my niche. But I truly believe that in liberation work, we all have a role, but it's our job to understand what is our role. Right. So mine became, okay, I'm really good at this design stuff. I've been working on this for years. My role is to be a facilitator. And it's not to come in and say, this is what the community is XYZ. So I just shifted how I thought about what it means to be my role. And that shifts how I build trust. So we have this tool we developed called Designing the Invitation, which is like, what are all the work that we need to do to give them a really thoughtful, like full of care, full of love invitation. And then what do we need to do when we walk into the room? Actually, one of our Liberatory Design co-creators just wrote a book called Design for Belonging. And she has this cool map of like all the moments, right? They're like, you invite them, you welcome them, you have your first conflict. I think she maps through like how to design all the pieces of belonging. And that's how I think about it. I think overall is like, they don't owe me their trust, but if I'm designing an invitation, I think the other thing is also treating them like humans that are going to contribute a lot and that really need to be there. Right. Because opposed to when you come to me and you're like, we're so glad that you're here. Thank you so much. I know you're so busy. And all of a sudden they feel like kind of disconnected from you. Or like, why are they treating me like I'm delicate? That was another thing I had to learn too. It's like, no, I'm going to push back when I disagree kindly. And I'm going to ask them to lead. I'm going to ask them to do this and that. I'd be like, let me not call on them in case they're uncomfortable. I'm like, well, they're adults. They can tell me if they don't want to do that. So trying to balance like giving them respectful, welcoming space, but also not treating them like blasts because like they got a lot to say, you know? But there are places where it's like clear it's not my role, right? Like if we're talking about a fully Indigenous community that has Indigenous council that's leading this design project, that's not one where I'm like, let me get in there. It's like, if I can offer value, I would love to, but I'm not going to like insert myself if it feels really off base or in a language that I don't speak. Sometimes folks, one person asked me to work with a translator. I was like, I think that's the line. I'm going to slow everybody down in this Spanish-led project. Like there are plenty of Spanish-speaking designers that can do this better than me. But everyone has to decide for themselves, I think is what I'm saying.
Brilliant. Awesome. Thank you so much, Tania, for your time. Could everyone give Tania a little round of applause or jazz hands, whatever works for you? So the video is recorded and I'll be sharing that link to everybody who registered. And just to say again, like, thank you all for your donations. We've raised $320 for the Ukraine emergency appeal. So that's awesome as well. So as I mentioned, if you want to hear about other events, please sign up to Social Design Sydney. There's a few other things I've got planned for the rest of the year. So thank you all. Hope you have a beautiful day. And thank you again, Tania. That was brilliant. Take care, everyone. Until next time.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time. Have a good one.
Thank you.